without further ado, I will hand over to Lewis to introduce the GER and the Net Zero Markets team. Lewis, over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Tom. And just to start off, I want to say thanks for the team and for all of you out there for joining us on this webinar. We're going to, as Tom has mentioned, introduce you to our latest product, the Global Emission Reduction, the GER. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lewis Redshaw. I'm formerly Head of Environmental Markets at Barclays Capital, and latterly, since 2014, CEO of Redshaw Advisors. And that's a company dedicated to demystifying environmental markets. And as a consequence of that work, we've developed a spin-off, Net Zero Markets, and that's the hat I've got on today. A little bit about me. I've been trading carbon since 2004. I've been a long-term and very passionate advocate of pricing carbon. I'm personally super keen on the benefits that efficient markets can bring to tackling the problem of climate change. And in my background, there's been a lot of compliance carbon trading, but even something as well established and on the face of it simple, like the EU emissions trading scheme, has presented hurdles to liquidity in the early days. And in those early days, there were no exchanges either. And we worked very hard in the early days of that market, an emerging market, to allow it to trade efficiently. Another challenge we set ourselves in 2006 was to standardize how the secondary CER market traded, so CER, certified emission reductions. Now, we developed a set of rules that we published to the industry. Ultimately, those rules were adopted by exchanges. Now, if efficient markets trade on exchanges. Exchanges have low transaction cost, high transparency. They are, in effect, all-day auctions. But getting the voluntary carbon market onto an exchange has been a massive challenge. And to meet that challenge, we assembled a team whose combined experience is second to none. We've distilled all of our extensive knowledge of emerging energy and other commodities markets. And with that unrivaled experience of carbon markets, we brought you a new product. I've got a larger team behind me to thank for being able to be here today to present the GER to you. It's been 2 years in the making. The GER is the future of commoditized voluntary carbon markets. So let's jump in. Now, as I've mentioned, we've got a separate company, Net Zero Markets. We're dedicated to developing risk management tools in the global environmental space. And our initial focus is the voluntary carbon market. And the objective is to provide easy, trustworthy, and pragmatic products for the ultimate objective, which is to address climate change. And in terms of the team that we've gathered together, there's me at the top. You know who I am now. I'm joined by Karim Kanji. He was a deeply experienced carbon market trader and other commodities, in particular in emerging and illiquid markets. Paul Simons, our general counsel, he's our lawyer, and his experience of all energy and commodity markets has been absolutely essential in producing the product we have today. For example, he's the chairman of the GER Supervisory Committee, a really important role and an important committee to make sure that the GER stays focused on its objectives. We're joined by Tom Lord, who introduced the webinar today. I've worked with Tom for a long time now, and he's been trading carbon, risk managing carbon for around 10 years. And prior to that, has extensive knowledge of how all registry and back office systems work. And then finally, our advisor, Peter Knowles, and he has extensive experience of energy markets also. He's our US representative based in New York. So what is the GER? Well, the first two things I'm going to come back to later on in the presentation. I'm going to concentrate on the bottom left here. The GER is a single global reference price for the voluntary carbon market. And I think that's the panacea. Much like the EU emissions trading scheme has a single price, a fungible carbon credit with no vintage. We wanted to try to design something that looked very much like that. The EU ETS having one of the most liquid markets in the world, certainly the most liquid carbon market. And we've succeeded, and I'll guide you through all of that. But to start with, I've got to frame the problem. And the problem is that the VCM doesn't work as a market. And the reason for that is there are too many moving parts. We have different standards. I've got examples here, gold standard and Vera. We have different jurisdictions. Some countries such as China typically have less popular carbon credits than countries such as Kenya. We've got lots of different project types, renewable energy, energy efficiency. We have forestry and other agricultural products. And there's lots of different vintages. There's quite some debate about whether old carbon credits are better or worse. And we can get into the detail of that perhaps in the Q&A. But the consequence of all of these moving parts is that carbon credits, different carbon credits from different projects, different countries, with different standards, with a different age, all have different prices. So we've represented that variation with our dots here. And the consequence of all of those moving parts and those different prices is that you have illiquid markets. There's only one seller typically of a given type of carbon credit and occasional buyers. You can't get liquidity unless there are lots of buyers and lots of sellers. The sheer variety makes for an impenetrable market. Even those that spend a lot of time on the voluntary carbon market can't say with confidence where the price is, what the price should be. We've got multiple prices, which I've mentioned already. And to explain the complexity and to get involved in the market involves a lot of thinking and hard work. And so the transaction costs are very, very high. Anyone familiar with some of the platforms out there offering carbon credits for sale will know that those platforms charge an awful lot more than the traditional commodity exchanges. All of these problems lead to low demand. And if you've got big barriers to entry, then many companies and people are going to be reluctant to enter. And we've also got a lot of conflicting validity viewpoints, by which I mean different people telling potential buyers what they should or shouldn't buy. We have some debate around forestry and how permanent it is. The opposite side of that is renewables, that is an avoidance that is permanent, but is it additional? And those debates go on and cause nothing but additional confusion for anyone that wants to be involved in the market. All of these problems, of course, as you'd expect, lead to low levels of investment in the carbon reducing projects, and everything combined creates distrust. Now, we have a lot of opacity in the voluntary carbon market. Opacity breeds some quite negative behaviors. That could include profiteering, even criminal activity. And we've seen all of those things and helps resolve such things. But you can get the picture here that the voluntary carbon market is not an easy to commoditize thing, and it is in dire need, frankly, of a solution. So how have we solved the problem? We are categorizing offsets into 4 buckets. And I'll start with the first 3 because those will be the first 3 that everyone is familiar with. And bucket 1, we call the base carbon contract. That includes renewables and energy efficiency. Bucket 2 is what we call the forestry carbon contract. That includes forestry, but other agriculture, forestry, and land use. Bucket 3, we're calling the prime carbon contract. Now that's carbon that has a load of social development goal boxes ticked. For example, that would include carbon credits issued by Gold Standard. Now those 3 groups are derived from our analysis of the carbon market. And so that analysis involves looking at retirements. It involves talking to buyers of carbon offsets. and it involves talking to professionals within the industry. So when we look at retirement, the definitions of carbon credits fall quite nicely into those three buckets in proportions that represent roughly a third each. When we talk to offsetting professionals, we can find that there are price brackets that attach themselves to these three buckets naturally. They did before, not a very clear thing, because in the early days of the voluntary carbon market, you had to be an absolute specialist to have any idea where carbon credits priced. But when you look at those, the price points, we'll find energy efficiency and renewables typically at the lowest point. We will find the prime carbon contracts probably next, more expensive, and then the forestry carbon contract to be the most expensive. Now, of course, I'm talking very rough terms, but if you look at the volumes available in each category, then there, of course, are specialist products that can achieve much higher prices than average, but on average, the prices fall into those three buckets. And then we added in a fourth bucket. Now, the fourth bucket is the carbon capture contract. Now, it's all very well offsetting with the first three buckets, but they're all avoidance. Carbon capture is all about removal. And the reason it's important is because today there is no reliable market for removals. But in 2050, everything needs to be a removal. There cannot be any avoidances. We can only have removals in 2050. So if we don't start facilitating a market and indeed finance going into carbon capture today, there's almost no chance that the capacity will exist to get us anywhere near the emissions reduction goals that we have in 2050. So our objective is to take the existing market, repackage it to reflect how the existing market uses the existing market carbon credits, add in carbon capture so that everybody gets involved in carbon capture, and we foster a new market. Carbon capture, of course, comes at a much, much higher price than the other components here. And so it's very important, firstly, to distinguish the price of carbon capture, but also to make sure that it doesn't dominate what we're doing, because very, very high prices will lead to low take-up. And indeed, the supply, frankly, doesn't exist for there to be a large proportion early on anyway. So we've got four buckets, and we combine them together in the GER. Now, I've put a figurative pie chart up here to show how the buckets might split in a typical GER. And you know, I've split up the avoidance categories roughly a third each, and the carbon capture contract is a small sliver. In fact, we'll start the product with 1% carbon capture, and we will divide up the other buckets based not on what we think the market should be doing, but what the market's actually doing. So we look at retirement data for the previous year, and we determine how the market has been using voluntary carbon credits, and we will then apportion the different buckets according to how they're actually being used. Now, it could be that a bucket becomes so small that it can no longer sustain liquidity. It could be a new bucket forms because a new type of carbon credit becomes popular. For example, in the forestry bucket, we would love to have a separate afforestation category to incentivize that higher price cost of making carbon credits. But the problem today is there's very little afforestation. That means there are few sellers. There might be more buyers that are interested, but sustaining a market and creating a price is very, very difficult. If we take the weightings of all of the buckets combined with the price that we will establish for each bucket when listed on exchange, we can actually create a weighted average price. And that's where the GER will come in. We'll have four prices for what we call the subcontracts, and we'll have a single price for the GER. We need to have the price differentiation to incentivize the different projects, as I've mentioned, but by having a single hybrid carbon offset that represents how the market is using carbon offsets and is a weighted average of the prices of those different buckets, then we can attain a reliable indication of a single price for the voluntary carbon market, which, as I've mentioned, is the panacea. So what are the key features? Well, I've already mentioned the single benchmark price, but by putting in the carbon capture contract in increasing proportion, and it's programmed in from the outset, then we create a pathway for companies to achieve net zero. Of course, companies must reduce their own emissions, and there's some fantastic guidance come out of the VCMI on how they should be making claims. But in order to get to the end goal, removals are going to be important. And so we want to foster that market and create a pathway to net zero for companies that cannot reduce all their emissions at the sorts of prices that carbon is attracting. Now, the percentage that will be carbon capture by 2050 is 100%. And obviously that's important to hit net zero in 2050. The rate at which the percentage increases is determined by a simple formula. It looks very much like the Oxford Principles approach to this particular problem. And if the market is retiring more carbon capture contract, carbon removals, than we include in our fixed pathway, this is where the GER Supervisory Committee comes in. We will increase the proportion of removals that make up the contract, that make up the GER. And that brings me to the bottom left here, that the composition of the GR reflects market trends. Everything we've done has been guided by the users of the voluntary carbon market. We're trying to avoid making any decisions on behalf of users. We want to be guided by those users. So as I've described already, the composition of the GER will evolve over time based on actual retirements. Finally, an accessible contract. We will trade or make available for trading a spot venue, a futures venue, and anyone that knows our partner, Air Carbon Exchange, will know that they use the blockchain extensively in their product offering in order to create electronic warehouse receipts. So we will be fully future-proof with a blockchain-assisted, low-friction trading environment. That means that participants don't need to have any of the voluntary carbon market registry accounts themselves. One of the beauties of their system is that it reduces the barrier to entry to this particular market. So what are the benefits? Well, I hope you agree that something that standardizes in such a way, in such an inclusive way, will lead to increased liquidity. Now, increased liquidity is important if you want to get greater transparency in the market. We want to scale the entire market by providing a liquid and easy to access product that is transparently priced. We aim to boost demand. We have primarily designed this contract for corporate offsetters that really don't want the headache of having to understand the market before they can transact in it. They just need to be confident that what they're buying is pretty much the same as what everyone else is buying, and they have an element of safety in numbers. But being able to make a carbon neutral claim with the GER will come with both transparent pricing as well as transparent claims. So we'll create the functionality, as the VCMI has called for companies to declare that they are offsetting with the GER, and the Net Zero Markets website will contain the details of all of the retired carbon credits that are related to GER retirements. Now, accessibility for a larger proportion of the voluntary carbon market is essential. So projects have long complained that they don't get a fair price for their product because offset retailers are selling what they have bought from the projects at inflated prices. By having a benchmark carbon price, everybody knows what the price of carbon is, and by having the four subcontract buckets, we further split out that pricing. Projects know what their carbon credits are worth. Buyers know what the carbon credits cost. So if we have that increased transparency, the funding to removal projects becomes that much more straightforward. Projects get a fair share of the money, and financiers get to see there's a transparent, liquid, fair market, and are more inclined to help lend money to those projects. And the final point here is that we've done everything on current market standards. As I've said, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're trying to take what the market already does, repackage it, and provide it back to the market in a digestible form. As the market evolves, there are expected to be other standards that come into the market. Now, in theory, other standards, extra standards, make the market more complex. What we will do, if those standards are being used by the market to any degree, then we shall include those standards in the mix and thereby take away the complexity that a new standard might bring. Now, how might the GER components evolve? Well, if we look at the far left-hand side of the graph, 2021's mix of use of carbon credits is more or less accurately reflected in this graph. And we can see that the split isn't quite 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, but it's pretty close. So the prime carbon contract is just over 20%, the base carbon contract about twice that, and then the forestry carbon contract somewhere in between. And we've created a fictitious projection of how that mix might evolve. The base carbon credit runs out over time, apart from anything, because Verra and Gold Standard have determined that they won't approve new projects in the renewables sector. But probably the most important element of this graph is the curve relating to the carbon capture contract. You can see that we have a curve that we have based at 1%. Actually, if you use the formula that we have, then the 2021 starts at 0. But we've started the first 3 years. We have put a floor in place at 1%, and that proportion increases, and it increases at an increasing rate, and that's important because in the early years the capacity won't exist for large quantities of carbon capture contract. But over time, we have to be aiming for 100% by 2050. There is no other outcome that can be acceptable in 2050. You cannot use avoidance carbon credits in 2050. Everything has to be a removal. So this hopefully gives everybody some idea of how this thing may evolve. And then there are other standardization initiatives that our product will be compared to. So I thought I'd get that comparison up and running. So first off, the GER is inclusive. Our objective is to include as much of the voluntary carbon market that exists today as we possibly can, as we reasonably can. And the reason for that is any attempt to standardize the voluntary carbon market that leaves behind another large chunk of the voluntary carbon market is probably not helping standardize, but actually helping confuse the market further. Certainly that large chunk that's left behind will be shouting loudly that they should be considered also. And that just creates extra noise and more people telling customers what to do and confusing them further. A classic example of that is a standard derived from the CORSIA compliant carbon standard. I speculated back in 2019 that CORSIA could be the solution for standardization of the voluntary carbon market. But the reality is the rules that they've developed are so restricting that the proportion of the total carbon market out there represented by the CORSIA contract is tiny. And so a standard built around CORSIA just can't work as a standard for the whole market. The other thing we've got is simple vintage rules. So we start from 2013. And there's a good reason for that, and we can perhaps get into that in the Q&A. The GER itself has no vintage. Like the EU allowance, there is no vintage. If you have vintages, we'll take ourselves backwards in terms of having a different vintage for every year from now to 2050 would create large numbers of different prices within the voluntary carbon market when the objective is to have one. We package long-lived carbon removals. I've talked about that quite a bit in the presentation. Corporates need a simple, easy to understand path to zero, and we can provide this. We can provide it through the GER. Now, as the cost of a GER goes up, as the proportion of carbon removals increases, companies will make natural choices for what they should do to reduce their own emissions. Certainly, companies should be doing whatever they can to reduce emissions, but the bottom line is it's not economic to go to completely net zero without some sort of incentive. That incentive comes from either a commitment to using a product like the GER over the long term, in which case a cost will be associated with that, or it comes from regulation. But while we don't have regulation, the GER gives the best alternative in the voluntary carbon market to that. And finally, the carbon neutral claim transparency. I've mentioned the VCMI have set out some very robust guidelines for how this should be done. And we will absolutely make sure that carbon credits that are retired in the name of the GER are fully transparent and published. And it's absolutely essential because one of the criticisms of the VCM is that it's opaque, and one of the opacities is what people are actually using to make carbon neutral claims, and we will make sure that's fixed. So we've had a bit of a rush through. The final slide is to talk about our partners. So we've partnered with Air Carbon Exchange based in Singapore, with the European Energy Exchange based in Germany, and with the Nodal Exchange based in the US. From the outset, Air Carbon will provide access to spot subcontracts and spot GER. EEX and Nodal will provide access to GER futures, which will be physically deliverable in terms of the underlying carbon credits. Nodal and Air Carbon Exchange launch this Friday. European Energy Exchange will launch soon after. I'm very pleased to have these partners on board, and it shouldn't be underestimated how much work goes into getting something like this onto regulated exchanges. And so I have them to thank, as well as our own team, in particular Paul Simons, for the hard work that goes into making sure that this is all done properly, legally, in full knowledge of the regulator, and our supervisory committee is designed specifically to avoid changing the rules within the GR as much as possible. So that's the last slide. I'm going to hand it over to back to Tom to pull together the Q&A. If you want to know more about this, then please do get in touch. This is a relatively simple presentation. The product is a simple product on the face of it, but the devil is always in the details. So people that want to actively trade this contract will want to know an awful lot more about it. We have that information to hand. We have a series of documents that we can provide to people so they understand the market that we intend to create in full. So please do get in touch. We'd be very keen to get your interest. And without further ado, I'll hand back to Tom, and he will field the questions. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Lewis. Thank you very much. That was an excellent guide through the GER. So we've got lots of questions coming in from all over the world. I think just highlighting the global reach of the VCM and the potential that is there. We literally have people joining from all over the world. So keep the questions coming. We'll endeavour to answer as many as we can. First up, Lewis, how do net zero markets address the permanence issue for carbon capture credits?
That's a really good question. So we've looked at this problem, obviously, in some detail. And when we look at things like forestry removals, afforestation, they're non-permanent. Now, of course, arguments can be made that they will be there, or statistically that permanence can be more or less established. But the bottom line is it can't be guaranteed. And unless, if someone wants to pollute an extra ton of CO2 because they're buying a removal, you need to be absolutely certain that that ton has been removed and will stay removed. So the way we have approached this is to, in recognition of the fact that the removal market is very nascent, we have determined that a removal needs to have 100+ year permanence, removal permanence, and it can't include forestry or agriculture. So it can include things like biochar, bio-CCS, and direct air capture, of course. So the test for a true removal is the 100-year mark for our product.
Thank you. How will the quality of credits be managed?
So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. One of the issues that the market has is the perception of quality. And we've seen a few companies providing their view of the quality of different types of carbon project. One of the interesting things about that activity is that some of them are saying a certain type of carbon credit is of a high quality and others are saying it's of a low quality. So automatically we're allowing confusion, more confusion potentially, to creep into the market. I think that the ultimate arbiters of whether a carbon credit is real and additional has to be the voluntary carbon standards themselves. And so we also recognize that outfits like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market are intending to assist those carbon standards with tightening their rules. I imagine those carbon standards would be very welcoming of some vindication of what they're already doing and any assistance that could possibly be provided to improve what they're doing. But we're not judge and jury, and can't be judge and jury about the quality of individual carbon projects, because why should we be trusted over anybody else in terms of opinion of what's a good or a bad credit? And B, that's what Verra and Gold Standard's job is. They're all non-profit organizations. They are well-intentioned and full of professionals. So we must accept that they are the ultimate arbiters of whether a carbon credit is valid or not, because they're issuing them. And they're not incentivized to issue more by money because they're non-profit organizations. So to move the market forward, we have to accept that those carbon standards are doing their job correctly.
Thank you. And we've got another question coming in here around essentially buyer's choice and buyer's preferences. So how will the GER deal with buyers who have specific requirements or looking for specific co-benefits, for example?
And that's another great question. The reality is most carbon credits that are retired are average. I mean, they have to be by definition, I suppose. But so the product that we produced here finds essentially the average carbon credit and packages it up and creates a single price. Now, if someone wants something that's somehow special, whether that's got certain types of STG, certain locations, then companies are free to go and find those. And what they will do is they will be able to compare what they found with the publicly available prices that we'll have by being listed on exchanges And they can determine for themselves whether they think the price that they have achieved is a fair one and worth paying for the specificity that they've got. When we look at things like the gold standard, the vast majority of carbon credits issued by the gold standard have 3 SDGs. And I think there's one project with 17. So the project with 17 SDGs will try and find a better price. If it can, then it should do so. If it can't, then it should sell itself into the prime carbon contract. What we're doing, we're not trying to take away the businesses of companies that are already out there doing a good job, doing a fair job in the voluntary carbon market. What we've done is created something that reflects the market and what it's doing in general, makes it easy for corporates to make decisions about whether they should trust and buy the GER and to enter therefore into the voluntary carbon market. But there'll always be specialist requirements, and those specialist requirements can continue to coexist. And the reason they'll coexist is because those projects are doing something better than the average, and if they can find a better price, then they'll take it.
Thank you. We've got a question around the credits coming off exchanges and being able to be traded OTC. Can GER carbon credits be taken off the exchanges and traded OTC? If so, how? And also, how are retirements processed across registries and with notations for who the retirement is on behalf of, etc.
So the carbon credits that trade on Air Carbon Exchange can be taken back out of Air Carbon Exchange, at least for the first year or so. Air Carbon Exchange can retire those carbon credits for the consumer, and indeed Air Carbon Exchange can issue non-fungible tokens that the consumer can use to evidence their carbon offsetting. And the consumer can be either the participant on Air Carbon Direct or a customer of the participant on Air Carbon. So retirement can be taken care of in that way. And indeed, to the extent that some companies are withdrawing carbon credits from Air Carbon because they're not planning to retire them, they want to send them somewhere else, they can do so. And so an OTC market can continue to exist. Our approach to this is to welcome all comers. We currently work with 3 exchanges. If there are other exchanges that are interested in what we're doing, then they're also welcome. We are exchange agnostic. And actually the same applies therefore to the OTC markets. Clearly, if to keep tabs on who is doing what in relation to the GER, if we're going to keep tabs on what's retired in the name of the GER, net zero markets needs to be involved in the transaction at some point. And we can explore details of that with companies that want to participate in that way. When it comes to the futures exchanges, the GER is physically deliverable, so the basket of qualifying carbon credits needs to be delivered at the expiry point of the future. So that's how delivery will take place. After that, the purchaser is free to do whatever they want with those carbon credits. They can sell them on, they can retire them, and if they want to retire in the name of the GER, they just need to make sure they include net zero markets in that activity.
We've got a question around the makeup of the GER as well. So on a transaction, does the client get a breakdown of the apportionment of each of the buckets or the pots? Or is this something the GER reports separately on an annual reporting type basis?
Yeah, well, the GER is going to, the GER Supervisory Committee will publish each year, at the beginning of each year, the statistics that it has decided upon that relate to the subcontracts, how they're retired in the previous year. So that will be publicly available information. So if you've bought a GER in that year, you can assume that it consists of that mix. the way it gets reported, if companies want specific details of every single carbon credit retired in their name, well, that's what holds the current market back, frankly. It does make commoditization of the voluntary carbon market very difficult if everybody wants something completely specific. So we will publish all carbon credits that are retired in the name of the GER, and on the Vera registry and the gold standard registry, any retirement will be matched, of course, and that retirement will be in the name of the GER. So customers make a claim on carbon neutrality with the GER. Registries have a record of all carbon credits that are retired in the name of the GER, and net zero markets will retain a list publicly available of every carbon credit retired in the name of the GER also.
Thanks, and going back to the age-old vintage discussions, we've got a question on the GER having no vintage. So can you just expand on that a little bit? So you have a single price. How does no vintage works with an evolving bucket of credits?
And that's another great question, and it can end in a complex answer. I'm going to make it as simple as I can in the time available. So the futures contracts will have the futures contracts will have a specification that needs to be delivered into each year, and that specification will change based on the retirements in the market. When we look at the evolution, the hybrid type carbon offset that we're trying to put together here, the model at Air Carbon Exchange works extremely well. We're not trying to create a new standard and rip up some other stuff and then create a new standard and issue carbon credits from there. We're taking those existing standards, we're ring fencing the carbon credits, we create a new carbon credit, if you like, called the GER, listed on Air Carbon Exchange with a blockchain underpinning in a tokenized format. So that token is not a cryptocurrency or anything like that. It's just a representation, an electronic warehouse receipt, if you like, electronic representation of the basket of carbon credits that make up the GER. At some point, we will make when GERs are created in this way, we will make that process irreversible. We would only ever do that, and the supervisory committee would make that decision. We'd only ever do that when it's clear that the GER can be sold as the GER in a liquid market. Up until that point, we will actually allow reversibility back out into the carbon credits. But by creating a hybrid carbon offset, we are able to release ourselves, the product, from the burden of vintages that only confuse the market further. And a GER minted in 2025 will be fungible with one minted in 2024 and so on.
Okay, thank you. And then perhaps another of the age-old arguments around quality. So within these buckets, if higher quality projects sell their credits outside of the GER, is there a risk of reducing the average quality of the GER credits? And I'll put quality in inverted commas, and I'll hand that over to you.
Oh, thanks. So it is the case, it's a fact, in any commodity market, a platform that lists those commodities has a set of criteria. And a buyer should expect that the seller is going to seek to provide the product that meets the quality criteria, but no better. So that is what we might expect to happen, that we would have sellers putting in to the contract what they perceive to be the well, not what they perceive to be, what will absolutely meet the quality criteria of the contract. What we see, the reality is that that delivery is always going to be a bit of a mixture of different types of quality, in inverted commas, carbon credit. So in the days that the EU ETS was very keen on using certified emission reductions, when futures came due for delivery, we would eagerly anticipate what would actually get delivered. And often you would get the carbon credit that meet the specification, but also often you'd get carbon credits that surpass this minimum specification. And that's just the way it works. If a seller of carbon credits can't get a better price than they can get in the GER subcontracts or the GER, then they will deliver what they've got to the GER. It's also the case that perhaps when you mix vintage and quality together, there's a perception that older vintages have a lower quality. The reality is, once all the older vintages, in our case 2013 is the cutoff, when there aren't any more, then it'll be 2014, and when there aren't any more of those, it'll be 2015. So arguably the quality, if you use vintage as a metric for that, the quality will increase over time.
And we've got a couple of questions around Article 6, how the GER may evolve, how it fits in with Article 6. So if you could give us a little bit of background on the thoughts we've had on that.
Absolutely. So Article 6 is a compliance market. It's not a voluntary market, but clearly there's an overlap between the voluntary markets and Article 6. Projects would like ideally to be Article 6 compliant, projects in the voluntary carbon market, that is. And the reason they want to be able to do that is because probably, the price of an Article 6 compliant carbon credit being a compliance instrument of some sort, the price of that will be higher. We can contrast today's average price in the VCM of somewhere around $8 to $10 with the price of compliance carbon credits. In the case of the EU ETS, we're talking $85. So that's the perception. The reality, we just don't know. We'll find out over time. Firstly, if Article 6 takes off in the first place, and secondly, whether it attracts a premium. What we can say with confidence, though, is that we have an evolving hybrid. So if the retirement data reveals that people are using a large proportion of Article 6 carbon credits, then it'll be clear as day for the GER Supervisory Committee to include Article 6 as a new bucket. So our objective, as I've mentioned in the presentation, is to roll with the market. We're trying to reflect in the product what the market is actually doing, and that's how any commoditization effort should ever work. It should be reflecting what the market is doing, and if Article 6 is being used, then it will do so.
Thank you. And then moving on to the exchanges, in particular EEX and Nodal. So have they given an indication which clearing members will clear the GER futures contracts? And then just building on that, if I'm an offsetter, how do I get hold of GERs if I'm not on the exchanges?
So the first point, I'll refer you to EEX and Nodal Exchange for clearing members. It's not information I've got at my fingertips, and probably would be boring for most listeners anyway. Both of those organisations have large numbers of clearers. On the second point, how do you get hold of a GER? Air Carbon Exchange will take exchange members more readily, shall we say, than some of the larger exchanges. And so if you're a larger corporate or an offset retailer, then getting an account on Air Carbon is going to be an awful lot simpler. Firstly, because you're probably going to want to retire most of what you buy, and secondly, getting access to a futures exchange via a clearing member takes a bit of effort, shall we say. so large corporates, intermediaries can access the GER. For individuals, we will certainly, when I say we, as part of the Redshaw Advisors Group, we have a company called Planet Zero. On Planet Zero, we have a holding page for the GER. Individuals can purchase GERs through that holding page, as they will be able to do through other intermediaries that offer the service.
Thank you. So kind of back to the vintage question a little bit, but a GER without vintage will nevertheless have an issuance date. As the GER mix changes over time, there will be differences between an old and a new GER. So wouldn't prices reflect this? So for example, by 2040, a GER will have a higher share of the carbon capture contract than it would have done in 2025.
So to commoditize anything, you've got to take the specificity away. We've set out that we don't want to have vintages in this product because we want it to be fungible and to look like carbon credits, like the EU allowance in the EU ETS. The reason for that is because you get a lot of liquidity, you get a lot of financing, you get great transparency, you get no confusion. When you buy an EU allowance, you get an EU allowance, and that's it. You know it's going to be valid because the exchange rules say so. And in fact, you can't deliver anything that's not valid anyway. We're trying to get the same thing into the voluntary carbon market. And by taking a simple average of the prices of all carbon credits that trade, doesn't work, right? Because the information is imperfect and the prices aren't necessarily competitive. By creating 4 buckets, we can create enough liquidity in those 4 buckets to allow us to create a price for the GER, even if the GER doesn't trade on its own. So we can have a single pricing point for the voluntary carbon market. If we introduce 30 vintages between now and 2050, then we're going to have 30 prices, and we don't want that. The market doesn't want that. We don't need that. So the way we achieve the no vintage is to take away the data that underlines the creation of that GER, and it's just a GER that is fungible with any of its predecessors, and can be used to make a carbon offsetting claim.
Thank you. So question around carbon credit rating agencies such as B0, Silvera. Going forward, if or how do you see this type of analysis being incorporated into the GER contract?
So the bottom line is that we don't. I think those organizations are doing a great job of helping people understand the thing that they're buying. I've mentioned before that there can be some contradiction between them, and that's obviously dangerous for liquidity and understanding of the market. But we would have, we would expect that Verra and Gold Standard to be incorporating any feedback or clever ideas or ways of doing things that these extra layers of scrutiny are doing. So what I mean by that is we have extra layers of scrutiny today that should be adopted by Gold Standard and Verra anyway. And to my mind, to our mind in the Net Zero Markets team, it's the extra standards, the extra measures of quality, I should say, add an extra layer of complexity. Our view is we should trust those standards. If those standards can be improved by the use of those quality criteria, then we absolutely welcome that.
Thank you. We've got time for a couple more, I think. So we've got a few questions around blockchain stroke tokenization, around how that works with regards to storing credits, whether it has a future in the VCM, and also around the standards. So for example, Verra recently announcing a halt to tokenizing of their carbon credits. So how does it work with the GER, and how might that affect it going forward?
So the futures exchanges are obviously immune from that because they have a physical delivery pathway. to get to the point where a GR has no vintage, it needs to be tokenized, as we've discussed. Tokenization is essentially a representation of the carbon credits in electronic form. So as I've mentioned, also electronic warehouse receipt is the equivalent. There's a difference between using the blockchain to reduce friction in markets and using the blockchain to try and sell something to you, somehow improving what it is. We're very much in the former camp. The only use for blockchain, in my view, our view, is that it should be used to make the market work more efficiently. If it's used to make the market work less efficiently, so for example, anything that dresses up certain types of offset because they're associated with a crypto asset or some other kind of token, that's not useful for the voluntary carbon market. What's useful is something that takes away the need to open several registry accounts. In the EU ETS, you get one registry account and it takes care of everything. In the voluntary carbon market, you need to have 5 registry accounts, maybe more, to be certain that you can take delivery of all the carbon credits that are out there. What Air Carbon Exchange does with its blockchain is Air Carbon operates those registry accounts and then gives you an electronic representation of what you've got in that registry account that's held in trust. And the whole process being reversible, the carbon credits can come back out again. But if you don't have any registry accounts, you can still participate in the voluntary carbon market directly through enterprises like Air Carbon Exchange, because they will hold the carbon credits for you. If you don't want them, you sell them. And if you want to retire them, Air Carbon will retire them for you. So blockchain used to reduce friction in markets is absolutely welcome, and anything else needs to be closely scrutinized.
Thank you. Net zero pathway. I know it has been at the heart of the thinking of the GER evolution over the last 2 years. What are the main barriers for the carbon capture contract eligible credits today? So, and how does the GER help to solve those?
So today there are companies that buy very expensive carbon removals and they reduce their carbon footprint with those. The only companies that can really do that are those with lots of money and a small carbon footprint. Essentially, there's two things. By essentially cornering that market and taking out all those carbon credits, they're not available for everyone else to use. But at the same time, there are companies out there doing great things by putting together chunks of money and investing in carbon removal projects, giving them long-term offtake contracts. So that's a good thing, but it's a bad thing if those carbon credits become monopolized in some way. Everybody needs access to carbon removals, and what we're doing is allowing everyone to have access to them, but without having that very, very high cost, because the carbon removal piece that goes into the GER, the cost of it is spread over, in the first year, the other 99% of the carbon credits in the mix. And that means that carbon removals are a market that everybody can participate in. The proportion, as I've mentioned, increases over time with a view to making people net zero compliant. And as I've also already mentioned, if you don't have removals, 100% removals in 2050, you can't have anything else. If you want to put a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere in 2050, you've got to make sure you're taking it out somewhere else.
Fine, and then we'll thank you. We'll squeeze a very quick one in. There's a couple of questions around the opening price of a GER. What does that look like based on current weightings and mixes? Just a rough answer.
Yeah, that's right. That's fine. So, well, the carbon markets are moving all the time. The voluntary carbon market, yes, they took a fairly big hit along with all the global stock markets. But I would say that you would get a GER pricing at around $7 to $8 today.
Thank you. So we've actually got loads more questions that we haven't got round to, over 30 in fact. But obviously we'd be going till midnight, I think, to answer them all. So we'll have to call it a day there. Lewis, any closing remarks or final points you'd like to make?
Yeah, and really to thank everybody for their time attending today. What we have here on the face of it is a simple product, and that's the objective, is to simplify the voluntary carbon market. As I mentioned, the devil's in the detail. Some of these questions have given some insight into some of that devil, as it were. It's important to relay to everybody. We think we thought of everything that could go wrong with this. We put a lot of hard work into this over 2 years, and we've leveraged experience that we've gained over the last 20, in some cases more. And what we would encourage people to do that are interested to find out more details is contact us, and we can let you know. Or indeed contact, if you're a member of any of the exchanges we've mentioned, contact them for the same information. We'll be going live on the 17th of June on Friday. We're very excited about that. It's been a long time coming, and we encourage everybody to dive in and get involved, and we look forward to speaking to as many of you as possible soon.
Thank you, Lewis. And thank you everyone for the participation. Some amazing questions there, and as I say, we've got a lot that's still unanswered, so we will the Net Zero Markets team will endeavour to answer them all and come back to every single one who's posed a question. Thank you very much for your input, and I'll draw the webinar to a close now. As Lewis mentioned, any questions, please do just reach out to the Net Zero Markets team. Thank you, and we'll speak to you all soon.
Thanks, Tom. See you.